agenda. And we are recording this meeting just so everyone's aware. So welcome to this conversation on sustainable financing for WHO. This is the slot that we normally hold our Pandemic Action Network Pandemic Preparedness Working Group. So welcome to all of you who regularly join this meeting. But I know there are others who are joining this meeting who don't normally join us, so very welcome. We've given this slot and are co-hosting this meeting with the Global Health Council and the United Nations Foundation. We're delighted today to use this time to talk about the very important topic of sustainable financing for WHO. For those of you who are part of the Pandemic Preparedness Working Group, we had the opportunity to engage with Bjorn Kummel, who we'll talk to in a minute, a couple months back, who gave a report out, I think it was late January, early February, Bjorn, from the working group's work at that time. But now, as we know, the World Health Assembly will be upon us in a few weeks' time in May, and that working group is preparing to present its recommendations to the Assembly. So we're at a critical moment to actually to hear what those recommendations are that are emerging, and to have an opportunity to provide some voice from non-state actors before that process goes forward to member states for their consideration. So the purpose of this conversation is really to get a readout of the working group on sustainable financing, their recommendations, and then to hear a bit also from the WHO Secretariat and their comments and views on those recommendations, and then really to hear from all of you, both to ask questions but also comments, so that can be taken into consideration in the final reports that go to member states in a few weeks' time. So we're looking forward to a rich discussion, and we'll ask people when we get to the discussion period to enter questions and comments into the chat. But first, it's my, and I should say that as many of you know, and particularly those who have been part of this working group, this Pandemic Action Network working group, the working group on sustainable financing, which again, I might ask Bjorn just to give a little more context for at the beginning, but it's part of a plethora of efforts and initiatives and processes that are underway that are looking at not just reform, that are looking at reform and strengthening of WHO, but also reform and strengthening of the global health architecture as it relates to global health and to pandemic preparedness and response. So this is an important piece. It's by no means not the only piece, but it's a very important piece given WHO's critical role in detecting, preventing, and responding to outbreaks before they become pandemics. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome and introduce Bjorn Kummel. Bjorn is the Deputy Head of the Global Health Division for the Federal Ministry of Health in Germany, and he is chair of the WHO Working Group on Sustainable Financing. So turn it over to you, Bjorn.
Thanks a lot, Carolyn, and it's a great pleasure to be with you all again. The second time, as you mentioned, Carolyn, I think we met the first and last time in January, right before the executive board.
Oh, it was right before, yeah. That's right, before.
I think it was before, well, I can't really remember because it
was just before your last meeting, yeah.
Exactly, and practically at that moment in time, the working group was supposed to, well, explain why it was unable to more or less come up with final recommendations and to finalize the recommendations. So indeed, the working group that I have the pleasure and honor to be the chair of, the mandate of the working group has been extended. It has been extended because the members of the WHO, the 194 member states, were unable to reach a full consensus on all the recommendations and in particular the one which seems to be the flesh of the debate, which is about ensuring that WHO has the right finances, namely through assessed contributions, through a substantive increase in assessed contributions. That was practically the piece that we were unable to agree upon until January, and which we are still debating. This is really a critical moment in time, Caroline, as you mentioned, for many reasons. One reason with regards to the working group, the working group will be meeting next week, Monday to Wednesday for the last time. We met then already 7 times. It will be our final meeting, and it is expected that we will forward something, that we will forward our recommendations, which need to be finalized then to the World Health Assembly through the PBAC, which is the Program Budget and Administration Committee. This is certainly now or never. This is not only now or never for this debate that we are having on sustainable financing for WHO, but it's also now or never with regards to learning and really understanding the lessons from COVID. And I think that becomes clear. I'm sitting not on your side of the Atlantic, but I'm sitting in Central Europe, and it becomes clearer and clearer. And this is actually what everybody said throughout this crisis and throughout this learning from the pandemic, that once the next geopolitical crisis comes up, we will have potentially already missed the magic moment, the window of opportunity to really learn from the past crisis. What we've actually done many times before, when we consider the Ebola crisis and many of the other pandemics before, the global community was unable to truly implement the lessons to be learned from those crises. And that was often because a next global crisis came up, normally not a global health crisis, but something else. Here in Europe, we are currently facing one of the severest crises that never, at least in Germany, nobody had dreamt of, a war in Europe. And that certainly puts much of the focus away from the pandemic and also from lessons to be learned. So it's a critical moment in time, making sure that we still use this closing window of opportunity to learn from this crisis, not only with regards to sustainable financing for WHO, but also with regards to all the other lessons that were drawn by the many panels that we asked to provide us with recommendations, be it the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response or all the other panels. So it's now or never. It's very clear it's now or never. The working group has met now 6 times. It will be meeting the 7th time. We've debated lots of things with regards to sustainable financing for WHO, but it becomes clearer and clearer that a substantive increase in assessed contributions is key. And I think one thing that everybody shares, even among the members of the WHO, the 194 member states, is that the status quo of WHO's financing is rotten, is not sustainable, is certainly unacceptable. Why is that the case? It is the case because there is a huge discrepancy in between what we as the world put on the shoulders of the WHO and what WHO is de facto able to deliver with the limited, unpredictable resources and often non-flexible resources that we provide to the WHO, while we keep on adding further expectations on the shoulders of the WHO. In between January and now, we've had lots of debates on the way forward. I've had numerous exchanges with ambassadors, with, practically everybody who was ready to talk to me, or members of the working group. I know that the DG has done lots of outreach on this with key stakeholders. He's been to the US, to Washington just recently, 2 weeks ago. Currently, he's in India, and he raises the severe issue, obviously, or the critical issue of financing for the WHO. This is certainly, it's often perceived as a technical issue, the financing for WHO. And this is why, I guess, for many of us, it seems unsexy to discuss the financing of an international organization. But it's certainly much more than a purely technical debate. It is primarily the question whether we want to have a strong WHO in the future. It's about the future of WHO, and it's about how we envisage global health governance post-COVID, whether it is better coordinated, more efficient, less fragmented, and truly led by a capable authority with a strong public health voice, and that is truly inclusive, having 194 member states at the table, or whether we envisage a global health architecture that is less inclusive because not everybody is sitting at the table, more fragmented, less coordinated, and therefore less efficient. That's practically what is at stake. It's the future of the WHO, because if we are not getting this right now, we will not have a second chance in the next 10 or 2 decades. And that, I'm saying, while we might not be able to increase sustainable financing for WHO, the world seems to be ready to finance lots of the other players in global health. This year alone, we'll see the replenishments in global health worth roughly 50 billion. While at the WHO, we are discussing to increase for 194 member states altogether, their assessed contributions by 1.2 billion, but not now, but over a period of 8 years in incremental steps, and obviously on a fair share based on the capacity to contribute for each member state. We have already in the working group reached a broad consensus on many things. And among those, a consensus that more flexible resources are needed for WHO, that we will explore a replenishment mechanism that already we know from Gavi, Global Fund, and the World Bank works for them. We have already we have already found a consensus that governance reforms need to be seen in parallel to a substantive increase in assessed contributions, and that we also have to look at cost recovery models for WHO. Where we haven't found a consensus on yet is on the substantive increase in assessed contributions. However, it needs to be recognized that if we're leaving member states representatives outside the room, there is a 100% consensus by all non-state actors, be it civil society, be it academia, be it private sector, be it foundations, whoever we are asking, everybody agrees that a substantive increase in assessed contributions is needed, and it's a low-hanging fruit to everyone. Apparently, it's a challenge for member states. While member states put on expectations on WHO, they seem to face a challenge increasing the sustainable financing. However, the overall debate has shifted. While a substantive increase didn't seem possible or not as possible back in January, I think the debate has shifted from then onwards, because we all realize also in the working group that this is not just technical. This is not just ensuring that WHO receives a little bit more funding, sustainable finances for the next 2 years, but it's practically about the future of this organization that all member states obviously want to have a strong WHO. So the working group, the bureau of the working group, my 5 vice chairs and myself, we were asked to map and clarify the way forward and to come up with a new proposal. As you might recall, we had issued a proposal to increase the sustainable financing of WHO and to hit practically a target of 50% in the biennium 28-29, so practically in 6-7 years from now, and to increase that and to have that increase practically worth 1.2 billion for 2 years for all 194 member states together, but in incremental steps, taking the decision at this World Health Assembly in May, but that the increase would only happen and be implemented in 2 years from now, but then incrementally. But that proposal didn't reach a consensus yet. So what we did is we sat back together and we discussed all the proposals that were on the table, and we practically we saw 5 different options, and we are now mapping one specific option which is similar to the one that we put on the table before, but is nuanced, which comes with new nuances. So practically our new proposal, which we are aiming to discuss next week, is we are saying we need to increase the assessed contributions to 50% in the future. Why we are saying that? We are saying that because we believe that there needs to be a clear alignment in between governance and finances. And 50% by the shareholders of these organizations who are practically saying and who are, in consensus agreeing upon the priorities of these organizations is not a huge ask. Plus, we are saying that this 50% increase or increase up to 50% of WHO's core mandate is needed in order to ensure the independence and integrity of the organization, ensuring that WHO's norm and standard setting role is perceived and is guaranteed. Plus, the WHO will be guaranteed to play the leading and coordinating role that we all envisage. So we are saying we stick to the 50% target because limiting that or reducing that would infringe WHO's ability to play its role and would infringe its integrity and independence. However, we are saying that this should happen in 3 steps. The first step should be decided through the program budget process, which is coming up, a substantive increase, but that the 2 further steps in the future should be dependent on the implementation of concrete governance reforms to be decided by the states. So that's practically the current proposal that we are putting on the table, that we have already shared with member states. We have, and I think the second.
Bjorn, you're freezing for a moment, so we've lost you momentarily, or perhaps it's me and mine is unstable.
It's not only you.
Excuse me?
Okay, so Bjorn, we lost you about a minute ago. So maybe as you were explaining the proposal on the table and then you froze for a bit. So perhaps you can just restate the last 30 seconds or so.
Okay, so practically our proposal is that this assembly in May will be committing to future incremental increases in assessed contributions, each to take effect concurrently with key budgetary governance reforms to an eventual level of 50% of the budget for 2020-2023. So practically that we are linking the AC increase, the substantive AC increase with governance deliverables to be decided by member states. And that is new compared to our old proposal that we were debating before and where we didn't receive a consensus. We are hearing from many member states that this is certainly a proposal that they positively can consider. And maybe my final word with regards to where we all stood as member states. The vast majority of member states believes that a substantive increase in assessed contributions is key. From all member states, we've heard roughly the positioning of 130 member states. And out of these, I would say roughly 120 member states explicitly said they are in favor of the 50% AC increase, roughly, while less than 10 member states were reluctant and concerned. However, we don't know about roughly 40 member states, I would say, and you could say that they were reluctant to, and it remains unclear a little bit where they stand. Are they in favor or are they hiding behind others who had the courage to say for them at this moment, they don't see an ability to increase? What are the main arguments that were raised? The main argument was fiscal constraints due to the crisis. However, to counter this argument, we said that the increase would not happen now. We are committing to the increase now, but the increase would only start in 2 years from now and then over incremental steps over 6 years. If we are looking at this in absolute terms, it's not a big ask for member states. This is doable for all member states, and this is in particular doable given the fact that the global community will most likely invest, as I mentioned, 50 billion just in global health replenishments this year. So it would be a strange political signal if for the one organization that is.
We have lost you again. You've frozen again, Bjorn. Let's see if we get you back. There we go. Bjorn, we froze again for about 10 seconds. You were saying that on the issue of cost, it would, given the amount of money that the international community is mobilizing, it's a bit of a red herring, huh?
Well, from my point of view, it would be a devastating political signal if we are able to invest in all these other global health actors, but
Right.
not in the one truly inclusive one, which is supposed to be the leading and coordinating agency. So I think it's true, coming back to your initial words, this is the critical moment. This is now or never. The decision will be taken next week, most likely. Member states can prove whether they want a strong WHO or they would have to explain what they want. For the chair of the working group, it is a challenge to explain, or it would be a challenge to explain to the broader public why, after 1.5 years debating this upside down, why we would be unable to increase WHO's assessed contributions substantively, knowing that everybody asks for that.
Bjorn, thank you so much. Really rich and clear explanation of what's on the table and the political context. And I know there's going to be lots of questions. I would just, I think, just to underscore your last point, that how can we say that we have enough money to mobilize for a range of institutions and not the one that's at the center, so which is WHO. So this is not an issue of money, as we know. This is an issue of political will. So, and I'm sure we're also going to want to come back to you and see if you can share more clearly where some of the outlier states are. We know some of them, but that would be extremely helpful. But let me first turn to Jane Ellison. Jane is the Executive Director for External Relations and Governance at WHO. And I know we also have with us today Imre Hollow. Imre is the Director of Planning, Resource Coordination, and Performance Monitoring at WHO. And I just want to give Jane, and if Imre has anything to add, just a chance to give the viewpoint from the perspective of the WHO Secretariat on these proposals and the needs of WHO. Over to you, Jane.
Thanks so much, Caroline, asking the inevitable first question, whether you can hear me or not. Good, that's great. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to the group today, and thank you particularly for bringing everyone together. It really is just so appreciated to have this mobilization of support from this very broad civil society group. So we really appreciate that in the Secretariat. Just want to compliment what Bjorn has said a little with a few things from the Secretariat's point of view. And I mean, obviously, first of all, big thanks to Bjorn, because as you can see, his energy is unrelenting. And we really are going to take this right through to the Assembly. This has been a very, very important process. And we sense it has some momentum now, which we want to maintain. Just a few sort of factual updates, I guess. So as Bjorn mentioned, there is considerable bilateral activity by the Secretariat. We have been raising this matter in discussions with member states, large and small, for many months now, but this has become more intense in recent times. And they do refer to some of those post-pandemic fiscal challenges and other issues. In particular, this whole relationship between greater accountability and transparency, etc., and further sort of investment in WHO. But I'll come back to that issue. But we are engaging in these discussions. A lot of senior officials of the key decision-making ministries are now really leaning into this discussion and sort of coming ready for a very in-depth discussion when they engage with the Secretariat. So that's very welcome, because that I think we've seen a lot of evidence that this issue has been taken extremely seriously by some of those who perhaps have been a little bit more reluctant to date, which is encouraging. There is a lot of interest in what could be achieved with this additional money. And I think one of the things I'd really like to stress to everyone who's on today's call is that this is not about more money, this is about better quality investment in WHO. And it's really important. I mean, if in future member states and donors want to give us more as well, then that's terrific. But this has never been about quantity, this is about quality of finance, which allows us to do things like invest in attracting and retaining the best talent, invest in programs that play out over, 2, 3, 4 biennia, not just a couple of years. And of course, expanding our donor base, which is something member states have always consistently urged us to do. But there's a lot of interest in what this additional sustainable finance might do over the next sort of 7 to 8 years. And Imre may well be in a position to sort of talk a bit more about that, because his team have been working overtime to produce lots of models to fulfill the bilateral interest. For the working group next week, the Secretariat has produced 3 papers to assist the member states to fill in those gaps, as well as the Bureau recommendations paper, which Bjorn just gave you the top lines on. There is also a paper which Imre's team have produced around efficiencies. This is obviously something that people are looking to hear from the WHO Secretariat quite reasonably, that we are using their money as efficiently as possible. And we've got some fresh things to say about that in a paper that has been prepared using the UN guidelines on how to measure the efficiency savings. And the other paper is a paper that's been produced to explain more the rationale for the kind of percentage that Bjorn was describing, that sort of 50%, and why that figure or something around that figure is so important. So that will be a key paper as well. Then that explores some of the, again, trying to open up and go into more detail on some of those key arguments. The other piece that the member states will have sight of before they finish their deliberations next Wednesday is the updated WHO investment case. This is being produced for publication ahead of the Assembly. The first investment case, people might remember, was in 2018, and that very much looked at the case for investing in global health more generally. This is very much more about the case for investing in WHO. And we commissioned a team of economists who have produced a report independent to WHO, which essentially takes a number of existing rigorous studies of the attribution to the WHO Secretariat of certain gains in global health across a range of subject areas. And then it extrapolates from that a value of the organization as a whole within the global health setup. And that we will be sharing with the member states a sort of advanced draft copy, because we're still moving through a series of internal processes of sign off on that. But the really good news and the top line is that the figure that's emerged from that rigorous study is that for every dollar invested in WHO, member states can see $35 return. So this is quite a conservative ROI figure. We want to under promise and over deliver. So we haven't tried to sort of take more attribution for WHO than is reasonable. We've used, as I say, very sensible conservative models, but the economic modeling is extremely encouraging about what can be attributed to WHO and its value. And we hope that that will be particularly helpful for finance ministries who might be making the final call on signing off on this additional longer term sustainable investment in WHO. And we've certainly had the feedback from member states that that was important. So everybody on this call will see that before the Assembly. We'll be producing it in all languages. It will be principally through a microsite, but we will produce a few written copies as well. It's not a governance document as such, it's the Secretariat's contribution to this debate, or one of them, but I think it'll be an important one. Last couple of points just to make. We're already looking to get working on some of the areas that member states we know are very keen on. So we're already beginning to think about what a WHO replenishment would look like, and I've got a small team working on that in anticipation of the recommendation of the working group. And we're also looking at how we can build on some of the existing reforms in this area of accountability and transparency. I mean, we're really proud of what we've done already, and Imre's team can say more about that, but we've done I think some great work on making our results more readily available, on bringing them to life, on being more rigorous about the way we score ourselves on our own outputs. But member states want to see more of that, and I think they want it to be in the most user-friendly fashion possible. So we're already thinking about what that would look like. And perhaps just to end almost where Bjorn did, really, you know, in terms of those big picture arguments, people are very susceptible to the now or never argument. I think that amongst the diplomatic community in Geneva, we see, as Bjorn said, that, you know, the world will move on. And so we see a lot of the missions in Geneva and a lot of the people we're interacting with at capital level really feel this is the moment to try and get this issue of WHO's financing on a much more positive trajectory than the one it's on at the moment. The issue around quality versus quantity, I just want to reiterate that, because it's all too easy to say WHO is looking for more money, but actually the multiplier effect of better quality finance, more predictable over several biennia into the future, is considerable. And the last thing I would just say is, again, what Bjorn said, you know, when you talk to some of the smaller nations who are worrying post-pandemic about whether they can afford even quite modest increases in their assessed contributions, I always make the point that, you know, WHO is your voice at the table of global health. And, you know, heaven forbid we have another situation like another pandemic or other major global health crisis. WHO is where small and middle income, you know, low middle income countries have their voice. None of us know where the next crisis might occur, but we want to make sure everyone has the ability to respond to it, to speak about it, to act on it. And that is where WHO comes in. So a strong voice for WHO means a strong voice for every country, and not just the larger nations who are kind of dominating the debate about how to respond to the pandemic at the moment. So I think those are some of the key arguments that get particular resonance with member states of all size. And I'll pause there, Carolyn, if that's okay.
Thanks so much, Jane. And again, that was really very helpful. I would just editorialize that I also think, yes, more efficient financing, but there is nothing, I think, wrong with expecting that we also need to increase resources for the organization as we are making that case for other global health organizations, given the threat. So I said to Dr. Tedros a couple of weeks ago, I'm struck by this sense within the global health community that we all have to somehow say that we're, you know, we're all working within the same budget pie. I actually think that collectively, as a community that is concerned about these global health more broadly, and specifically about pandemic preparedness and response, and you know, leveraging, you know, this moment to actually address underinvestments, that we need to be making the case for that pie to grow. So I think it's both more and more efficient. So as I said, Imre Halo is also here and is available to answer questions, but let me turn it over now, and so that we have enough time for Q&A, over to my colleague and partner, Kate Dotson, Vice President for UNF, who's gonna lead us through the discussion. Kate, over to you.
Thanks, Carolyn, and thanks to Jane and Bjorn already for your great overviews. Wonderful to be with so many partners and colleagues and allies in this space. So I made a note in the chat. I'm happy to facilitate this discussion over the next 20 minutes or so before we adjourn with Kiki from the Global Health Council. So please do feel free, excuse me, please join us by raising your virtual Zoom hand if you'd like to give an oral intervention, or writing down a comment or a question in the chat. Hope to get to many of you. I want to start maybe with a level setting question for those who are newer to this issue, to Jane and Imre maybe. Can you just breathe life into some of the real implications of the current financing model? You know, I've heard Imre speak in other forums about pockets of poverty. Jane, you referenced, for instance, the value of quality funding allowing to attract top talent. Just level set where we are in terms of where the financing for WHO is broken, and what are the kind of real implications that that's had for you in the context, for instance, of the last 2 years.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I'm going to suggest to him if Imre could perhaps come in a little bit on this, and I'm happy to augment.
Thank you. So I think, first of all, thank you also for this opportunity and for organizing this event. It's really, really appreciated, and we're really thankful for that. So I've been really thinking about this question because we talk about the pockets of poverty. We talk about programs which can't really take off because we don't have the financing. But I think maybe the most important element is that we really are operating, even though we're a big international agency, like a sort of a pop and mom shop in some cases. It really depends completely on the individual in certain areas and the initiative of this individual, how much he or she can fundraise, the relationships, and whether you're a rich program or a poor program depends on these very ad hoc manners. So we're not allowed to, I should put it this way, operate like a real professional entity. And in one of the working group meetings, there was a video which even struck me by our head of office, the WR in Iraq, where there were constant emergencies, etc. And he said that he has a staff of, I think it was around 100, but he said there were only 2 or 3 people who have sustainable contracts or long-term contracts. Everybody else was on 2-3 months contracts, 6 months contracts, etc., from the whole workforce. And this can mean that these people are on these contracts for years, potentially even decades. It doesn't mean that they're not long-term WHO staff, but whether they can have a contract extension will depend and will be decided in 2-3 months increments, depending on the availability of volunteer contribution. So I think this has huge implications on everything. One issue is efficiency, because our staff have to spend a lot of time trying to raise funds, and if they manage to do that, then they have to keep that relationship with the donor. And then there's separate reporting, there's separate administration of these funds, and we have thousands of these little awards that we need to maintain with all kinds of parallel systems. So I think if really there's like one word to describe the implications, it's really professionalism. But of course, depending on in which area you are, it can be that some of the key areas, for example, in NCDs or disability or but even in emergency preparedness, some things just cannot happen because there's no proper financing available. Back to you.
Thanks, Imre. I think that Iraq example is a really compelling one, especially in a really fragile context like that WHO only has 2 colleagues who are able to be on sustained contracts. Thank you.
Hey, can I give you,
please, Jane.
Can I just give you just a brief specific example as well, which I think will matter a great deal to many of the people listening, as it matters to us at WHO. You know, we are, for obvious reasons, we are extremely keen to do much better in the area around responding to and preventing sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment. We're really taking this issue extremely seriously, and we are looking to invest in it. One of the areas in which we're looking to put more in the revised programme budget is into this area. But to give you an idea that, you know, recently we were given a grant that has a year to run. So actually it's to the end of this year, and with a slight allowance of spilling over, essentially by February 2023, we would need to have used this grant. Now, this grant very generously looks to invest in this area and to invest in allowing us to recruit expertise in countries, particularly in fragile environments. But what happens at the end of that grant? You know, this is a classic area where it's highly skilled. We want to be able to grow the expertise within WHO to be the best in the UN. And we want to be able to really plan this as a long-term program, you know, over the coming years, decades. And you can't do that when you're funding it out of 1-year grant money. because towards the end of those contracts, as Imre was saying, you're basically looking at where do you find the next money. Now we are looking to, we have put money in the revised programme budget to invest in that, but that's not funded money at the moment. But this is a classic example of a core institutional strength within WHO that we want to be able to invest in for the long term to attract and retain talent in highly specialised areas that will help to make us a stronger organisation. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, Jane. I want to ask about the reforms, and that is the kind of prevailing proposal, Bjorn, that you suggested is kind of going into next week's working group meeting. Can you talk a little bit about what is the potential scope for reforms? What are you hearing from member states they're most keen on in order to kind of reach those further milestones that are outlined in your recommendation now? Just to give us a little bit of context on that. It doesn't obviously get through the working group meeting before those become more clear, and certainly the processes to come. But give us a flavor for what you're hearing from member states might appeal there. And then I wanted to also ask, and then I'll come over to some of the questions that are emerging in the chat, wanted to also ask about this notion of kind of that member states will buy into the goal, the longer term goal, it sounds like, will also buy into a near term incremental gain or incremental increase in assessed contributions, but it leaves a little open-ended, those next few steps, right? How to, with the mandate of the working group expiring at this assembly, as we understand, how will momentum be kept in order to make sure these negotiations are fruitful, productive, and result in that 50% end goal? Don't just kind of mire in, in lack of attention and will, and don't get across the finish line in the end.
Thanks, Kate. And before I will answer your two questions, I intend to also answer the question before, because I think it needs to be crystal clear. So I think, and I've been covering WHO now for roughly 10 years, as it might have become clear through my accent. So I'm a German civil servant, and I'm practically also, while I'm the head or the chair of this working group, normally I represent Germany in WHO. So I have some insights of WHO, and currently we are obviously also one of the key donors. So which areas are underfunded? I think in this ongoing pandemic, it's a disaster, and it's a politically completely unjustifiable that Pillar 2, which is WHO's work in health emergency, remains chronically underfunded. It's been chronically underfunded after the Ebola outbreak, while everybody has said that we need to invest more in preparedness. Have we invested more in preparedness? No, we were unable to invest more in preparedness. And it potentially, I mean, this investment would have, obviously we wouldn't have avoided this crisis overall, but we would have positioned WHO better to respond better and do its job better, coordinating, etc. So Pillar 2, that's certainly a political, completely unjustifiable that it remains chronically underfunded. One of the if we are looking at the disease burden of disease, then NCDs come in, yeah, in many of the countries that potentially many of the participants come from. So NCD is the core burden of disease. So how many people, how many experts work for WHO in the NCD cluster? You can count them potentially with, I don't know, I guess it's really a limited number. How many cancer experts do we afford WHO for its staff? Currently, Germany is, I think, the top donor when it comes to NCDs, and we are not investing much. It's not a huge sum that we are investing in NCDs because it's completely dried out of finances. Another issue is pre-qualification. In area where we are heavily dependent, obviously, on finances coming from a generous non-state actor donor, which is obviously great. But if you're discussing with WHO, with colleagues from the WHO, what their day-to-day work to a large extent is, it's to some extent making sure that the wages are being paid, that they can fund their next program. And that is not a program in 2 years from now. It's their ongoing program because they are lacking long-term finances. I think Imre has missed to say that WHO is managing 3,000 awards from voluntary contributions. I mean, someone has to do that. It's not Imre and Jane doing that. It's obviously they are involved, but it's technical people. So people who WHO employs because they bring in the top class scientific knowledge to, I don't know, cover NCDs or cover infectious diseases. What their day-to-day work is to at least some extent, making sure that donor X receives exactly their reporting, what they want as reports for their voluntary contributions, and then making sure that the next donor receives their grant report. So it's a bizarre, ineffective system that we set up through financing WHO through these voluntary funds. And I think we certainly need to change that. What reforms are needed? I think that's, Kate, is a key question. And it's interesting because many of the member states in the debates of the working group have argued we need more transparency, we need more accountability, and we need more efficiency. But if we ask them, what do they mean in concrete terms? Normally, they are unable to explain that. Obviously, WHO is a big organization with 8,000 staff members operating in very severe, difficult circumstances. And obviously, there is room for improvement on all sides, whether it's transparency, accountability, and efficiencies, like in any huge organization. But what we should recognize is that we've come a long way. Also, this DG has already implemented key reforms. WHO is a truly accountable organization when we're looking at the internal auditors and external auditors reports every year, and that's my task to do that. We are seeing that with regards to accountability, WHO has come a long way and is really committed. It's an organization that is receptive to calls from its member states to further change. When we're looking at transparency, and especially when it comes to budgetary transparency, I would doubt that there are many international organizations that are as transparent as the WHO. With the budget portal, you can see exactly where the money is coming from and where it flows. It's really top class, and it's a key example, and I think it's best standard in the UN. With regards to inefficiencies, well, we in the working group, we've asked the Independent Expert Oversight Advisory Committee, top experts who come from the private sector in order to provide us with their guidance, how we can address inefficiencies within WHO. And what they said was, well, obviously you can look at lots of things. You can reduce travel, you can reduce meetings, etc. That's possible, but that's not huge sums that you can spare anymore. The key mechanism to increase or to fight inefficiencies, what they said openly in the debate is change the way you finance this organization. It's completely inefficient, or it creates huge amounts of inefficiencies because the WHO has to deal with all these 3,000 grants. Now coming to your last question. Well, it's a mixed version with regards to the long-term commitment and the short-term commitment. What we are asking is a clear political signal that member states are willing to go to the 50%. So an agreement in principle that we are striving towards the 50%, and that we already envisage that the first step will happen next year, that then the second step will happen in 3 years from now, and the third step in 5 years from now. But we are also recognizing that this needs to happen, and this will only happen in return to governance reforms that are purely in the managerial remit of the Secretariat. Now, what concrete governance reforms are needed still needs to be defined by member states. Yeah, obviously in consultation with the Secretariat. But one key thing where we certainly need to be better is setting priorities within the WHO. And this is not criticism towards the Secretariat. It's primarily criticism towards us member states, because we often are incapable of setting clear priorities when we are creating the program budget. But I think it's less a question to me, it's more a question to each member state. What do they need from the WHO in order to give green light to a substantive increase in assessed contributions? And as I mentioned from the outset, this needs to be answered by 10 member states, because the rest is ready to give green light already now.
Well, Bjorn, so this is a great segue since you just mentioned 10 member states. We've got a couple of questions in the chat around where some of those fence sitters may be, or which member states may be good targets for advocates to direct their energies over the coming days and weeks. I wonder if you might be able to give some clarity into that, and then we can probably, if that is a brief answer, get to one last quick question before we move to Kiki, and that's about, and maybe I'll link Courtney's question with Sarah's in the chat, and that's about how can this process also yield, fewer earmarks, but a clearer sense of kind of ROI on specific lanes of WHO's work. So for instance, one might take health emergencies, how to create a multi-year clarity of what can be achieved with voluntary financing that is less earmarked, and that achieves kind of greater return. So if you maybe tie in replenishment is a tool basically to allow donors to crowd in voluntary financing towards a clear investment case. How are you thinking about that in the context of, the non-AC dimension of what the working group is talking about? So first on member states, and if we get through that fast, a brief word on that question about the voluntary side and the role of replenishments before we turn to Kiki to close.
Okay, Kate, I think the most tricky question is obviously which member states. And as I have the pleasure, but also honored to be the chair of this working group that has 194 member states, I'm not going to blame anyone for their position. I think it's fair. This is an ongoing discussion, and it's from the outset, I've made it clear that this is a learning exercise, where we come from potentially different positions, but we need to persuade each other. And if not everybody is on board yet, then that is a clear indication that the arguments have not been presented most striking to some of the constituencies. However, I would also say that obviously when it comes to assessed contributions, and you're looking at the UN scale of assessment, then certainly some member states, pay a stronger burden than other member states. That's clear. The US is the top donor, China the second, Japan the third, Germany is fourth, and just those four together pay every second US dollar in assessed contributions. So it's fair to say that those, from my point of view, who pay the strongest, or who cover the strongest burden of this increase that we talk about, obviously need to discuss, and in particular in their constituencies, and making sure that they have the right arguments to persuade their ministries of finance, their state secretaries, etc. And I think that's ongoing. We are seeing that with many of the ones who've raised their concerns in the last meeting. We are seeing that they are moving, and I can give you a list of countries who have raised their concerns, but who are now, I think, at least from what I hear, more positively thinking about the new proposal on the table. The US, Japan, Poland, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Paraguay, many of those have raised concerns, fiscal constraints, but also the need to explain why we are investing in this international organization such a huge increase, and why not in others. And I think those are fair points. I don't want to say any member state should be blamed for articulating their clear position. However, I obviously hope that we are finding a consensus for an ambitious increase in the meeting next week. But I'm very, very positive. I think that everybody understands that this is now or never, and that saying no to the proposals and not coming with a proposal that is acceptable and truly a game changer, because that's needed, would be a devastating signal and hardly acceptable, I think, to the global health community. So that was the answer to the question which member states, but and maybe again, because that's your role as civil society, I think it doesn't matter. I think practically we don't need to figure out who are the ones who are still not fully on board. We also need to hear the voices from everybody else. A challenge in the working group was that even those who are in favor often didn't articulate them loud and clear enough in the working group. And I hope that's gonna change. We need to hear from the Caribbean member states, for example. I know that the Western Pacific small island countries, they are completely on board. They are enthusiastic and very much in favor of this. I understand that they will come in loud and clear and stronger than before. We know that the entire African countries are absolutely in favor and would see this as a devastating signal if member states in consensus are unable to give green light to an ambitious reform and sustainable financing. Now, coming to your final question, how is this linked with more flexibility? I think that the replenishment offers quite a lot. We've discussed in the working group innovative ways of financing a WHO, and the one way the one big innovation or innovative way would be a replenishment, which works for Gavi, Global Fund, and the World Bank. Obviously, they have different, very different governance structures than the WHO. But we are not asking in the WHO to fund everything through a replenishment, but rather to finance half of WHO's core mandate through assessed contributions, and to look at the last part, potentially with a big chunk coming in through a replenishment. Why is a replenishment interesting? A replenishment is interesting because it provides Global Fund, Gavi, and the World Bank with practically purely flexible resources, and resources not just for 1 year. And that's the political reality that WHO faces. The voluntary contributions come in for 13 months, yeah, and then they are over, and you don't know whether the donor is willing to provide something afterwards anymore. But the replenishments offer long-term predictable finances for 3 to 4 years, depending on how you design the replenishment model. And that certainly would be a true game changer in conjunction with the steps that we are envisaging, the substantive AC increase that certainly is needed.
Thank you so much, Bjorn. And I know that we are running up on time. For those of you I don't know, I'm Kiki Kalkstein, Director of Advocacy and Engagement with Global Health Council, and just so glad to be able to partner with PAN and with UNF to be able to co-host the session, and just will be very brief in remarks, saying a huge thank you, Bjorn, to you and to Jane and Imre for joining us and helping those on the line better understand what the current context is. I think that advocates across all of the networks that joined today clearly know that this issue is incredibly important. I think you said earlier that it's an unsexy issue, but I think across the board for many of us who work in the global health space, we know that this piece around sustainable financing and having better predictability on WHO's resources is so incredibly important. For me, the lines that resonated the most was really, now or never. And I think that as advocates, and as we look forward to seeing the additional reports that come out, and really in this lead up to WHA, and that's a phrase that advocates can continue to use in their work to express to their home countries why support for the proposal and the increased assessed contributions is so critical, because we all rely on WHO. Like you said, the expectations, the amount that is put on WHO's shoulders, and what the whole world wants the institution to do is only really going to be possible if everybody steps up. So I think we across the organizations that are here are ready to continue to support in whatever ways is useful. And we just thank you for coming and joining us to help groups better have a sense of the current state of play and what the path forward is. So we will keep an eye out, I think, for those additional reports. We will be keenly watching to see what comes out of the meeting next week. And I think wish you very good luck in those discussions. And that's it. Just a big thank you, and we will continue to try to do our part. And if there are ways that any of the groups here or NSAs and the rest can support, you know how to reach us. So please do reach out. Carolyn, back over to you for any final word.
No, just to add my thanks. And I think you have a community of support here broadly for the case for increased sustainable financing. So please stay engaged with us. We hope these views will feed into the final deliberations of the working group and the executive board and the assembly. And we look forward to being continuing to engage with you on that process. So thank you all. And thanks to everyone for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Carolyn.
Have a good day.
Thank you for the support. Bye-bye. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you also for the good suggestions. We'll look into those.
And we will
Thank you.
capture all of this. Thank you.